2 empty front row seats at my wedding revealed a truth I had denied for nearly 30 years. My parents only showed up for the child they wanted to show off. 3 weeks later, my father brought a thick folder to my office. "Just sign this," he demanded. He never realized he was handing me the exact evidence required to empty their bank account. No tears this time, just math, a lawyer, and the bank. My name is Paige Underwood, and I am 34 years old. I stood in the shadowed vestibule of a small botanical chapel in Charlotte. Wrapped in a heavy silk wedding dress I had paid for entirely by myself, my thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my phone. I swiped down to refresh my messages one final time. The screen remained blank. I knew they were not going to text. I knew it in the marrow of my bones. Yet the pathetic, lingering hope of a daughter conditioned to beg for scraps had forced me to check anyway. I locked the screen and slipped the phone into the hidden pocket of my dress. Through the slightly parted double doors leading into the sanctuary, the afternoon sun spilled across the polished floors. My eyes bypassed the floral arrangements and the softly murmuring guests. They locked immediately onto the front row, left side, the bride's side. Right in the dead center of the most visible spot in the entire room sat 2 vacant seats. Resting perfectly centered on the velvet cushions were 2 crisp, gold foil name cards, Ronald Underwood and Diane Underwood. The emptiness of those chairs possessed a gravity that seemed to suck the oxygen straight out of the room. It was not a sudden emergency that kept them away. It was a choice. A choice made with the casual cruelty that had defined their relationship with me for as long as I could remember. Exactly 18 days ago, my parents had packed their designer luggage and flown first class to Charleston, South Carolina. They did not just fly in for a quick visit. They stayed for 6 entire days. The occasion was the grand opening of Harbor Ember, a trendy new rooftop lounge owned by my younger brother, Beau Underwood. For 6 days, my mother's social media feeds transformed into a relentless broadcast of maternal devotion. There were photos of her clinking crystal champagne flutes under expensive outdoor heaters. There were videos of her dancing under strings of amber patio lights. There was a glowing portrait of her tightly hugging Beau's wife, her beloved daughter-in-law, against the backdrop of a vibrant coastal sunset. The caption beneath that particular photo was burned into my retinas. "So proud of our boy, building an empire." They had energy for 6 days of parties, flights, and endless socializing, but my wedding was taking place a mere 30-minute drive from their front door. When I had called them to finalize the timeline, my mother had sighed heavily into the receiver. "Paige, you know my back just cannot handle those hard wooden pews," she had said, her voice dripping with manufactured exhaustion. "And the doctor strictly warned me against sitting in one place for long periods of time. The cold drafts in those old churches are just terrible for my joints." She had literally danced on a rooftop in the coastal wind less than 3 weeks prior. She had stood for hours greeting Beau's investors, but driving 30 minutes and sitting for a 45-minute ceremony for her only daughter was an insurmountable physical hardship. A warm, solid hand wrapped around my cold fingers, pulling me from the memory. I did not need to look up to know it was Owen Mercer. My soon-to-be husband stepped into the vestibule. Looking incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, he gently squeezed my hand, his dark eyes scanning my face with a devastating level of comprehension. Owen saw right through me. He knew my current demeanor, the perfectly straight spine, the dry eyes. The steady breathing was not genuine calmness. It was the absolute, hollow numbness of a person who had been disappointed so many times that the nerve endings had simply stopped registering the pain. "They are not coming, are they?" Owen said softly. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of a harsh reality we had both been silently bracing for. "No," I replied, my voice sounding flat and foreign even to my own ears. "The wooden pews are apparently too much of a medical risk." Owen's jaw tightened. He pulled me against his chest, careful not to crush the silk of my dress, and kissed the top of my head. He did not offer hollow platitudes. He did not tell me they might be running late or that they were missing out. He just held me, absorbing the shockwaves of my silent grief. Just then, the heavy oak door beside us opened, and Owen's father, Arthur Mercer, stepped into the quiet space. Arthur was a stoic, kind man who had worked with his hands his whole life. He looked at Owen, then at me, and finally out through the crack in the doors toward the two empty chairs in the front row. His expression softened with a deep, paternal sorrow that I had never once seen on my own father's face. Arthur cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Paige," he began, his voice low and incredibly gentle, "if your family is unable to be here today, I want you to know something. It would be the greatest honor of my life to walk you down that aisle." He said it with such sincerity, such quiet dignity, that it physically hurt. It was a beautiful, generous offer, but hearing those words spoken aloud acted like a sharp blade cleanly severing the very last, pathetic illusion I had been clinging to. My father was not going to walk me down the aisle. My parents were not going to show up at the last minute. I was entirely alone on my side of the room. "Thank you, Arthur," I managed to say, forcing a tight, grateful smile. "That means the world to me, really. But I think I need to do this part on my own." Arthur nodded slowly, understanding completely. He squeezed my shoulder and slipped back into the sanctuary to take his seat on the groom's side. The wedding coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard tight against her chest, rushed up to me. She looked frantic, her eyes darting nervously toward the empty seats. "Miss Underwood," she whispered urgently, "the front row. Should I have the ushers quickly remove the name tags? We can spread the other guests out so the gap is not so noticeable." She wanted to hide the shame. She wanted to orchestrate a polite fiction for the sake of the photographs. I looked through the doors at those two gleaming gold cards resting on the velvet cushions. For 34 years, I had covered for them. I had smiled through the neglected birthdays. I had rationalized the missing tuition checks. I had smoothed over their constant, glaring absence in every milestone of my life so that no one else would see how little they cared. I had spent my entire existence making sure their blatant favoritism never made them look bad to the outside world. Not today. "No," I said, my voice suddenly ringing with a cold clarity that startled the coordinator. "Leave them exactly where they are. Do not touch them." "Are you sure?" She hesitated. "It will be very obvious in the photographs." "I am absolutely sure," I replied. "I want them left right there, in the center." For the very first time in my life, I wanted every single person in that room to see the exact shape of my parents' absence. I wanted the aunts, the uncles, the friends, and the colleagues to stare at those empty chairs and ask themselves why. Let the silence in the chapel do the talking. Let the visual of those vacant seats serve as a monument to their choices. I took a deep breath, adjusting my grip on my bouquet. The sorrow that had been choking me for days suddenly evaporated, leaving behind something much colder, much harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Those two empty chairs were not a tragedy anymore. They were the opening shot. They were the quiet, undeniable proof I needed to finally stop trying to win a game that had been rigged against me since childhood. The heavy wooden doors swung fully open, and the opening chords of the processional music swelled through the sunlit room. I stepped forward into the light, my eyes locked dead ahead on the empty space they had left for me. I did not shed a single tear as I walked down the aisle. I was done crying over Ronald and Diane Underwood. They had made their choice, and soon they would find out that my retaliation would not be measured in tears, but in an absolute reckoning. Every family operates under a hidden constitution, a set of unwritten laws that govern who receives grace and who is expected to endure. In the Underwood household, the supreme law of the land was established early and enforced with a quiet, suffocating consistency. The rule was simple. Bo was a delicate ecosystem requiring constant cultivation, financial rain, and emotional sunshine. I, on the other hand, was the resilient weed that could survive in the cracks of the concrete. I was the strong one. I could handle it. That was the exact phrase they weaponized against me to justify a lifetime of neglect. I remember the precise afternoon I finally decoded how the family budget actually worked. I was 10 years old. I had been playing a rented violin for 2 years, practicing in my bedroom until my fingers were calloused and bleeding, eventually earning first chair in the regional youth orchestra. My instructor had pulled my mother aside to tell her I was exceptionally gifted and was ready for an advanced masterclass program in the city. I stood in our kitchen later that day, clutching the informational brochure like a winning lottery ticket, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mother barely glanced at the paper before sighing heavily and aggressively wiping down the granite counter. "Oh, sweetie, we just cannot swing that right now," she said, her voice laced with a practiced, synthetic regret that I would come to know intimately. "It is entirely too expensive. You are doing just fine on your own." I folded the brochure, walked to my room, and never asked again. I understood that money was tight, but that illusion shattered less than a month later. That same summer, a glossy pamphlet arrived in the mail for Bo. It was an advertisement for an elite, private baseball camp spanning 6 entire weeks. My parents sat at the kitchen table, excitedly discussing the benefits, and wrote a massive check the very next morning without a single hesitation. The contrast between us became a physical weight by the time I turned 13. Becoming a teenager is supposed to be a milestone, a moment of recognition. My mother remembered my birthday on her commute home from work. She stopped at a chain grocery store and purchased a generic sheet cake with neon pink frosting that tasted overwhelmingly artificial. There was no party, no friends invited over, not even candles to blow out. Just a card signed hastily in blue pens sitting on the kitchen island. Yet, later that same year, Bo turned 10. For his milestone, my parents went into a frantic planning mode. They rented out the entire community pool complex. They hired a private disc jockey to play music. They catered high-end barbecue for 50 people. And, the specific detail that still twists like a knife in my gut, they ordered custom matching shirts for the whole family that read Bo's Big 10 in bold letters across the chest. I was forced to wear mine, standing near the shallow end, watching my parents orbit my brother as if he were the center of the solar system. Even my sheer academic effort was treated as a standard, unremarkable baseline. When the state standardized test scores arrived in the mail during high school, I opened the envelope with trembling hands. I had spent months studying in the quiet isolation of my bedroom, using borrowed prep books from the public library because I knew better than to ask for a paid tutor. I had scored in the 99th percentile across every single subject. It was a near-perfect score. I proudly placed the paper on my father's lap while he was sitting in his recliner watching a golf tournament. He did not mute the television. He briefly glanced at the numbers, gave a single, curt nod, and said, "Good." That was the absolute extent of his pride. Not 10 minutes later, a neighbor stopped by to drop off a misdelivered package. My father immediately launched into a booming, enthusiastic monologue, not about my academic triumph, but about how Bo had shown incredible natural leadership by organizing a neighborhood water balloon fight over the weekend. You learn, eventually, to stop putting your hand out when you know the only response will be an empty palm. I became an expert in emotional origami, folding myself smaller and smaller until I took up almost no space at all. I stopped asking for new clothes. I stopped asking for help with difficult school projects, because every single time I presented a perfectly reasonable, normal need, it was instantly weighed against some sudden, catastrophic, urgent requirement of Bo's. My need for braces was delayed indefinitely, because Bo needed a specialized private coach to improve his pitching arm. My desire to go on the senior class trip was out of the question because Bo urgently needed new, top-of-the-line lacrosse equipment. The most insidious part of this dynamic was that Bo was not an inherently evil kid. He was not a cartoon villain plotting my downfall in the shadows. He was simply a boy who grew up in a house where gravity functioned differently for him. He lived in a manufactured reality where every closed door automatically swung open as he approached, so he naturally assumed that was just how the universe worked for everyone. He never once looked back to see me picking the locks with bleeding fingers. When I turned 16, I did not ask for a car. I knew the answer. Instead, I walked 3 miles to a local diner and secured a job wiping down sticky tables and pouring cheap coffee. My uniform was a hideous polyester blend that permanently smelled of stale grease and bleach. I saved my tips in a shoebox under my bed to pay for my own college application fees and, eventually, my own gas when I bought a beat-up, rusty sedan from a local junkyard. Meanwhile, Beau turned 16 and was immediately handed the keys to my mother's old sport utility vehicle, along with the car. He was given a dedicated credit card just for gas, a generous weekly allowance, and a bottomless well of excuses whenever he failed. When he backed his vehicle into a neighbor's retaining wall, it was just an unavoidable accident. When he failed sophomore biology, it was entirely the teacher's fault for not recognizing his unique learning style. He was surrounded by a fortress of endless, expensive protection. In that house of distorted mirrors, there was only one person who saw the reflection clearly. My grandfather, Walter Beckett. He was my mother's father, a man of few words who smelled faintly of peppermint and old paper, but his quiet eyes missed absolutely nothing. During chaotic family gatherings, while my parents were busy performing their customary roles as Beau's personal press agents, Grandpa Walter would seek me out. He never made a grand spectacle of his support, likely to avoid setting off my mother's defensive wrath. He would simply sit down beside me on the porch steps, watch the blatant favoritism play out on the lawn for a long moment, and then look at me with a piercing clarity. "What is it you actually want for your future, Paige?" he would ask, his voice low and steady. He always emphasized the word you, as if to deliberately remind me that I was a separate, valuable entity from the family unit. "Do not tell me what they want you to do. Tell me what you want." He was the only adult in my life who did not accept the convenient narrative that I was fine. He knew that being labeled the strong one was often just a heavy mask forced upon a child who was profoundly unsupported. He saw the rust on the armor they made me wear. Looking back from the vantage point of adulthood, the trajectory was set so early on. Every denied request, every forgotten milestone, every dollar diverted to my brother to catch him when he stumbled, they were all tiny, accumulating fractures in the foundation of our family. People look at a collapsed building and think, the earthquake did all the damage. They do not see the decades of quiet water damage, the ignored structural warnings, the slow rotting of the load-bearing beams. The fracture in our family did not begin in that botanical chapel in Charlotte. The wedding was not the earthquake. The wedding was just the day the roof finally caved in. It was simply the first time the deep, systemic rot of my family's dynamic was dragged out of the shadows and exposed to the harsh light of day for the rest of the world to witness. I walked across the graduation stage with a degree in nonprofit data analysis and a leather-bound folder containing a heavily mortgaged future. When the initial university tuition bills had arrived 4 years prior, my parents had sat me down at the kitchen table. They folded their hands, adopted expressions of somber martyrdom, and explained that they simply did not have the financial bandwidth to support 2 children through a 4-year higher education program. They told me I would need to secure my own funding. I signed master promissory notes with federal lenders and high-yield private student loan companies until my hand cramped. I took on tens of thousands of dollars in compounding debt at an interest rate of 7.9%. During that exact same time frame, my brother decided traditional college was too stifling for his creative vision. He enrolled in an exclusive, unaccredited, short-term business incubator program on the West Coast. The tuition was astronomical, roughly equivalent to a down payment on a luxury home. My parents liquidated long-term certificates of deposit to cover the upfront costs. Beau attended for exactly 3 semesters before dropping out, claiming the instructors were suppressing his natural entrepreneurial instincts. My parents did not bat an eye. They simply redirected the remaining tuition funds into his checking account so he could figure out his next big move. I stepped into the American workforce with a negative net worth and a desperate need for stability. I secured a position at the Northbridge Community Renewal Fund. It was a mid-sized, rigorously audited organization that managed large-scale revitalization grants for low-income urban neighborhoods. My job was entirely rooted in reality. I analyzed massive data sets, verified contractor expense reports, and audited public funding allocations. I lived my life inside complex spreadsheets. My colleagues used to joke in the break room that I possessed a supernatural ability to detect financial discrepancies. They said I could hold a printed balance sheet up to my nose and literally smell a fraudulent line item from 3 cubicles away. The truth was far less magical. I was just meticulous. I found profound comfort in the absolute, undeniable certainty of mathematics. Numbers were impartial. A column either balanced or it did not. Numbers never made excuses for a golden child. My financial reality was a strict, unyielding grid. I rented a tiny third-floor walk-up apartment in a neighborhood where the streetlights frequently burned out. My heating consisted of a single clanking radiator that smelled like burning dust every November. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a cracked rear bumper. I never ordered drinks with dinner. I bought my professional workplace attire from thrift stores and clearance racks. Every spare dollar I generated was funneled directly into my loan servicer's online portal. I was determined to dig myself out of the hole. Then, during my 3rd year at Northbridge, my father tore a ligament and required a comprehensive knee replacement surgery. He was out of work for 2 months. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice trembling with panic. She detailed the hidden costs of his physical therapy deductibles, the sudden spike in their utility bills, and the overwhelming stress of managing a single-income household. I felt a familiar, crushing wave of conditioned guilt. That very night, I logged into my mobile banking application and set up an automatic wire transfer. On the first day of every single month, $300 moved directly from my checking account to theirs. I categorized it in my budget as a temporary medical relief fund. That temporary fix quietly morphed into a permanent, multi-year obligation. 6 years passed, and that $300 continued to vanish from my ledger every 30 days without fail. While I was meticulously tracking my grocery expenses and delaying basic life milestones, Bo was burning through capital at a terrifying rate. He became a serial founder of doomed concepts. First, he launched a mobile craft cocktail experience. My parents funded the purchase of a vintage Airstream trailer and high-end commercial mixing equipment. He secured 0 city permits. Within 8 months, the municipal health department shut him down, and the rusting trailer became a permanent, expensive fixture in my parents' driveway. Next, he pivoted to the boutique wellness industry. He opened a high-intensity interval training studio in a rapidly gentrifying downtown district. He signed a catastrophic commercial lease and purchased imported rowing machines. That venture lasted exactly 11 months. The commercial landlord locked the doors for non-payment, and the equipment was swiftly repossessed. My parents drained their remaining liquid savings to cover his broken lease agreements, his unpaid vendors, and the heavy legal fees required to dissolve his limited liability companies. In my family's vocabulary, Bo never failed. He simply transitioned through necessary experimental phases. Every financial disaster was spun as a vital learning opportunity for his eventual, inevitable massive success. They subsidized his endless delusions, while I subsidized their basic grocery bills. I delayed everything. I postponed traveling to Europe. I pushed the idea of home ownership into a hazy, unreachable future. I abandoned my goal of pursuing a master's degree because I could not stomach the thought of taking on another massive federal loan. I convinced myself that this was simply the heavy burden of being the responsible adult in the room. I truly believed my silent endurance was a virtue. Owen Mercer walked into my life right at the absolute peak of my financial exhaustion. We met at a community park cleanup sponsored by my organization. Owen was a middle school science teacher. He drove a practical hybrid car, spent his Sunday afternoons grading exams at the kitchen table, and possessed a quiet, steady decency that I had never encountered before. He was not flashy. He did not speak in grand, empty promises. He just showed up, consistently, day after day. More importantly, Owen possessed an alarming ability to see straight through the elaborate, defensive scaffolding I had built around my family's toxic dysfunction. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. My mother had called me while Owen and I were making dinner in my cramped apartment kitchen. She casually asked if I could wire an extra $200 that month. She claimed the county property taxes had suddenly increased, but I knew for a documented fact that Beau was currently trying to secure an expensive commercial liquor license for his latest hospitality project. I hung up the phone and immediately began pacing the worn linoleum floor. I started rationalizing the request aloud, citing my father's old medical debts, the rising rate of national inflation, and the general difficulty of their situation. I was spinning the exact same tired excuses I had used for nearly a decade. Owen gently set down the wooden spoon he was holding. He turned off the stove burner. He did not look angry, but his expression was incredibly firm. He crossed the kitchen, placed his hands squarely on my shoulders, and physically stopped my pacing. He looked me dead in the eyes and stripped away years of my carefully constructed denial with a single, devastating sentence. "Paige," he said, his voice completely level and devoid of hesitation. "You are not a backup automated teller machine for a family that has never once treated you as their number one priority." I stood frozen. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to defend the people who shared my last name, but the absolute, undeniable truth of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. For the first time in my entire adult life, someone was actively refusing to let me set myself on fire just to keep my brother warm. Owen did not ask me to cut them off right then and there. He did not give me an ultimatum. He just forced me to finally look at the math, and the math clearly showed that I was systematically bankrupting my own future to fund a family that would never, ever do the same for me. Owen and I got engaged on a Tuesday evening in the cramped living room of our rented apartment. There was no hidden photographer lurking in the bushes, no elaborate choreographed flash mob, and certainly no extravagant diamond ring that required a second mortgage. He gave me a beautiful, ethically sourced sapphire that he had saved up to purchase for over 8 months. We celebrated the moment with takeout from our favorite neighborhood Thai restaurant and a $20 bottle of Prosecco. It was absolutely perfect. We immediately agreed that our wedding would reflect the reality of our life together. It would be intimate, fully funded by our own modest savings accounts, and entirely free of the suffocating financial drama that had defined my early adulthood. I did not ask my parents for a single cent to help cover the costs. I only asked for one thing. I wanted them to show up, sit in the front row, and pretend, even just for one afternoon, that they were genuinely happy for me. That simple. Standard request coincided disastrously with my brother's latest reinvention. Beau had recently married Tessa Vale, a woman who treated her social media grid like a high-stakes corporate portfolio. Tessa was a master of the curated digital aesthetic. She operated under the firm belief that an experience did not actually happen unless it was documented with perfect lighting and a sponsored hashtag. Together, Beau and Tessa had conceptualized his most ambitious and expensive venture yet. They were opening a rooftop cocktail lounge in Charleston called Harbor Ember. While Owen and I were quietly finalizing our wedding, my parents poured all of their energy into Beau's Charleston launch. Through my phone, I watched them travel, celebrate, and proudly document every moment of Harbor Ember's opening week. One particular afternoon, while I was sitting on my living room floor, meticulously tying tiny silk ribbons around our homemade wedding favors, my phone buzzed with a notification. My mother had uploaded a professionally edited photograph. It showed her and my father flanking Beau on the newly finished rooftop terrace. The sunset behind them was a brilliant, fiery orange. They were all holding artisanal cocktails, their faces stretched into identical, radiant smiles. Beneath the image, my mother had typed out a caption that physically made my chest tighten. "Nothing makes a mother prouder than watching her son build something magnificent." I looked away from the brightly lit screen and glanced at the stack of my wedding invitations resting on the coffee table. One of those exact envelopes had been mailed to their house 2 months prior. It was thick, beautifully letterpressed, and completely, utterly ignored. Not once had my mother posted a picture of it. She had never updated her status to say she was excited for her only daughter's big day. My impending marriage existed in a complete digital blackout. It was a non-event, entirely unworthy of their public celebration. Exactly 7 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, I called my mother to go over the final logistical timeline. I needed to confirm when they would arrive at the Botanical Chapel, so we could schedule the family portrait session. "Which chapel was it again?" my mother asked, her voice crackling slightly over the speakerphone. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of a daytime television talk show playing loudly in the background. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. "The Botanical Chapel, the one on the north side of the city. I sent you the detailed itinerary 3 times. Mom, it is literally printed on the back of the invitation." "Oh, right. I just have so much on my mind right now," she replied dismissively. She sounded genuinely confused about an address that was less than a 30-minute drive from her own driveway. Yet, just weeks prior, I had overheard her effortlessly reciting the exact operating hours, the signature drink menu, and the VIP guest list for Beau's soft opening to a neighbor over the backyard fence. She had memorized his entire business model down to the garnish on the drinks. But my wedding venue was a baffling mystery. The final, fatal blow was delivered 3 days before the wedding. I was at the bridal alteration shop, standing on a small wooden pedestal while a seamstress pinned the final hem of my dress, when my phone rang. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I answered, a sudden, cold dread pooling in the pit of my stomach. "Paige, listen," my father began. His tone was brisk and businesslike, the exact kind of voice he used when he was canceling a golf tee time because of light rain. "Your mother is having a really tough time with her lower back. Her sciatica is flaring up terribly. We are not going to be able to make it on Saturday." The seamstress paused her work, looking up at me from the floor with wide, sympathetic eyes. The silence on my end of the line stretched out, heavy and suffocating. "She cannot sit in those hard wooden chairs for that long," he continued, filling the quiet with rapid, practiced excuses. "And the weather report says it might be a bit chilly. She really should not be moving around much in the cold air. It is just a medical precaution. You understand how it is." I stared at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I saw a woman who had spent her entire life twisting herself into impossible knots to accommodate these people. The anger that finally broke through the surface was not hot, loud, or explosive. It was freezing cold and remarkably clear. "Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of any accommodating warmth, "you two just flew halfway down the eastern seaboard. You rode in cars. You climbed 2 flights of stairs to get to a rooftop lounge. You stood on your feet for 6 straight hours in the coastal wind during Beau's opening party. Do not tell me about her back." The line went dead silent. He was not used to me pushing back. He was used to the old Paige, the compliant girl who would simply swallow the massive disappointment and assure them that it was okay. The silence lasted for 10 excruciating seconds before he finally spoke again. And when he did, he dropped the medical facade completely. "Beau really needed us there. Paige." He said it quietly, almost defensively. But those 6 words were the most brutally honest thing he had ever said to me in his entire life. They were the Rosetta Stone of my existence. Beau really needed us there. In that singular moment, standing under the bright fluorescent lights of the tailor shop. The final piece of the puzzle snapped violently into place. I realized that the deepest, most agonizing part of this dynamic was not that my parents were simply busy people. It was not that they were financially strained or geographically inconvenienced. It was the undeniable fact that they viewed my brother's basic desires as mandatory, historical events that required their total, unwavering devotion. Meanwhile, the most significant, defining milestones of my life were treated as optional, tedious details that could be easily skipped if they caused even a minor inconvenience. Beau was an investment. I was a write-off. "I understand," I said softly. And I truly, finally did. "Goodbye, Dad." I did not wait for his response. I lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the button to end the call. I stepped down from the pedestal, thanked the seamstress, and walked out to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and opened the master spreadsheet on my phone that tracked our final guest count. I navigated to the first row, left side. I highlighted the names Ronald Underwood and Diane Underwood. I deleted their meal preferences. I deleted their confirmation status. I wiped them from the logistical equation of my future. But when it came to adjusting the actual seating chart, I stopped. My finger hovered over the screen. A new, unfamiliar sensation began to take root in my chest. It was a profound, unyielding sense of justice. If I removed their chairs, I would be protecting them. I would be doing what I had always done. I would be hiding their failures so the rest of the world would not judge them. I locked the phone and placed it in the center console. I would not remove the chairs. I would leave those two prime, front row seats exactly where they were. They would sit there, empty and glaring, as a silent, physical indictment of everything my parents had chosen to be. It was the absolute end of my enabling, and the quiet beginning of my reckoning. The chapel tucked inside the city botanical gardens was bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. The air smelled of crushed eucalyptus and blooming jasmine. Everything looked exactly as Owen and I had meticulously planned, down to the final folded napkin and the precise arrangement of the floral arch. When the string quartet began playing the processional melody, Arthur Mercer stepped forward to offer me his arm at the edge of the aisle. Taking his solid, reassuring arm felt incredibly warm, yet simultaneously sharp with an undeniable ache. Every single guest turning in their wooden pews to watch us understood the heavy subtext of this arrangement. Arthur was stepping into a vital role that had been casually abandoned. His gentle smile and steady, grounding pace were a beautiful gift to me, but they also magnified the glaring absence of the man who should have been standing beside me, giving his daughter away. As we walked slowly past the polished rows of seating, I felt the collective gaze of 50 people subtly shift. Their eyes traced the intricate lace of my dress, moved up to my face to gauge my emotional state, and then, inevitably, darted toward the front row on the left side of the room. The two empty chairs with the gold foil name cards acted like a visual black hole, swallowing all the joyous attention of the room. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my maternal aunt tightly clasp her hands together and look down at her shoes. A few of my college friends in the third row exchanged heavy, loaded glances, their expressions tightening with secondhand outrage, but nobody said a single word. The polite, suffocating silence of well-mannered people pretending a tragedy was not unfolding right in front of them was far worse than if someone had gasped aloud. That collective, unspoken pity coated my skin like a physical weight, making me feel a profound, burning humiliation that I could not simply brush off or smile through. It was the humiliation of being publicly discarded. When I finally stood opposite Owen, holding his hands at the altar, I tried to focus entirely on the warmth of his skin and the absolute, unwavering certainty in his dark eyes. I recited my vows with a clear, steady voice that did not betray a single ounce of the turmoil churning in my stomach. I promised to choose him every single day. I promised to build a life grounded in mutual respect and equal partnership. But right as the officiant asked for the rings to be presented, my peripheral vision betrayed me. My gaze flicked, just for a fraction of a second, to those two vacant velvet cushions resting less than 10 feet away. In that fleeting glance, I did not just see two missing parents who had decided to stay home. I saw my entire childhood sitting right there in the front row. It was a perfect, physical manifestation of everything I had ever been given by them. Everything I had learned to expect. Total, absolute emptiness. The reception that followed was held under a large, elegant white canvas tent erected on the main garden lawn. It was an evening deliberately stripped of unnecessary extravagance, filled instead with excellent local food, flowing wine, and genuine laughter. The Mercer family danced together, offered heartfelt, funny toasts, and welcomed me into their fold with an open, uncomplicated joy that felt entirely foreign to my system. Yet, their vibrant celebration only served to cast a long, dark shadow over the partially unoccupied tables designated for the Underwood side. The joy of Owen's family made the emotional poverty of my own family impossible to ignore. Later in the evening, as the jazz band played a slow-tempo song, my closest friend from university pulled me aside near the outdoor bar. She handed me a fresh glass of white wine and leaned in close, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective anger. "Your parents should be deeply ashamed of themselves," she whispered, her voice tight and shaking slightly. "To do this to you today of all days, it is unforgivable." I took a slow sip of the cold wine, letting the sharp taste ground me in the present moment. I looked at my friend and offered her a small, completely resigned smile. I felt no urge to defend them anymore. "They are not," I replied quietly over the sound of the music. "They are probably having a lovely evening watching television. The tragic joke of my life is that I'm the only person in my family who has ever felt any shame." Late that night, long after the final guests had departed and Owen was unbuttoning his crisp dress shirt in the quiet sanctuary of our hotel room, I sat on the edge of the mattress. I reached into my overnight bag and unlocked my phone. I opened my text messages, my voicemails, and my email inbox. I scrolled through everything. There was absolutely nothing from them. There was no delayed apology blaming unexpected traffic. There was no defensive text message claiming a sudden, severe medical emergency. There was no digital gift card, no brief congratulatory note, no recognition whatsoever that my marital status had changed, feeling a strange, morbid curiosity. I opened my social media application. The very first item that populated at the top of my feed was a newly uploaded video story from my mother's account. I tapped the screen. It was not a message for me. It was a reshare of a photograph taken exactly 3 weeks prior, showing her holding a glowing martini glass on Beau's bustling rooftop patio in Charleston. She had added a large, animated digital sticker over the image that read, "Take me back to the best weekend ever," for the next 21 days. My parents maintained an absolute, unbroken silence. They did not call. They did not write. That extended period of deliberate quiet did something fundamental to my internal architecture. The hot, frantic anger that usually follows a fresh betrayal slowly burned off, evaporating into the atmosphere. What it left behind in my chest was a glacial, calculating coldness. It was a highly dangerous kind of clarity. I stopped waiting for an apology because I finally understood that an apology would imply they believed they had done something wrong. When the first day of the new month arrived, my automatic calendar alert chimed softly on my desk at work. It was the monthly reminder for the $300 financial transfer I had faithfully executed for nearly 7 years to help with their alleged utility bills and medical debts. I sat in my office chair, staring at the notification. I opened my mobile banking application and logged into my portal. I navigated to the recurring transfers page. I stared at the designated recipient names, Ronald and Diane Underwood. I thought about the empty chairs. I thought about the first-class flights to Charleston. I thought about the decades of being told I was strong enough to handle everything on my own. Then, with a single, deliberate press of my thumb, I deleted the automated routing rule. The screen refreshed with a small green check mark, confirming the permanent cancellation of the transaction. I closed the application and placed the phone face down on my desk, for the very first time in almost a decade. I was going to keep my own money. I wanted to know what it felt like to hold on to the resources I had earned. The invisible tether snapped, and the weight that lifted off my shoulders felt like the terrifying, exhilarating beginning of an entirely new era. Exactly 21 days after my wedding, the receptionist at the Northbridge Community Renewal Fund buzzed my desk extension. She told me I had a walk-in visitor waiting in the front lobby. I assumed it was a municipal contractor dropping off a revised budget proposal or a late expense report. I smoothed out my professional blazer, grabbed my yellow legal notepad, and walked down the long carpeted hallway. Sitting on the very edge of the leather waiting couch was my father. I stopped dead in my tracks. I had not seen him or spoken to a single member of my family since the afternoon he called to casually cancel his attendance at my wedding. He was wearing a crisp, navy blue designer polo shirt, the exact expensive garment he strictly reserved for attending my brother's upscale launch parties and private investor dinners. He looked entirely out of place among the stark, fluorescent lighting and sensible filing cabinets of a non-profit auditing organization. He stood up quickly when he saw me approach. He did not step forward for a hug. He did not offer a belated congratulations on my marriage. He did not even acknowledge the massive, silent chasm that had opened between us 3 weeks prior. He simply stared at me, clutching a remarkably thick, overstuffed manila legal folder tightly to his chest like a physical shield. "Paige," he said. His voice clipped and unnaturally loud for the quiet office environment. He cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting toward the glass doors of the small conference room adjacent to the lobby. "Do you have a private room where we can sit down for 5 minutes? I have some urgent family paperwork that requires your signature right away." I stared at him. I wanted to ask him how the weather was in Charleston. I wanted to ask him if the wooden pews in this waiting room were too hard for his delicate back. But the cold, fiercely analytical part of my brain, the part that hunted for hidden discrepancies in public funding grids every single day, took over immediately. I nodded once, unlocked the door to the small meeting room, and gestured silently for him to enter. He took a seat at the circular table and immediately began pulling documents from the thick folder. He was moving with a frantic, jerky energy that I had never seen from him before. "Your great-aunt Lorraine Beckett passed away late last month," he began, slapping a heavy, staple-bound packet onto the table. "It is a tragedy, really, but she left behind a modest estate to be divided equally among all her great-nieces and great-nephews. You and Beau are both listed as direct beneficiaries." "I am sorry to hear about Aunt Lorraine," I said flatly, keeping my hands folded perfectly still in my lap. "Yes, well," he continued, completely ignoring my sentiment and rushing forward. He leaned over the table, tapping his index finger rapidly against the paper. "The estate lawyer handling her final will is being incredibly difficult. The man is an absolute nightmare. Truly. He is a real stickler for unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. He refuses to release the final disbursement checks to any of the heirs until every single family member signs a global asset confirmation release." My professional intuition flared instantly, sending a sharp warning signal through my nervous system. That was not standard probate procedure. I audited legal compliance for public grants for a living. I knew how contracts functioned. You absolutely do not need to sign a blanket release of historical family assets to receive a simple, direct inheritance from a deceased great-aunt. I watched him very closely. A thin sheen of nervous sweat had formed on his upper lip. He was flipping through the dense legal pages far too quickly for anyone to actually read them. And, most tellingly, he absolutely refused to meet my eyes. He was staring intensely at the center of the wooden table, his jaw clenched tight. "What exactly am I confirming, Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and quiet. "Just a standard historical accounting waiver." He rushed out, pushing a specific page toward me and pointing firmly to a yellow highlighted line at the very bottom. "Just sign right there on the line. It merely confirms that certain older assets, things handled years ago by the family, were properly distributed within the immediate household. It is just a minor formality so the entire family is not penalized and delayed from receiving Lorraine's money." I did not pick up the black pen he offered. Instead, I pulled the document closer to me. It was indeed a release of liability form, but it was not attached to Lorraine Beckett's estate in any way. It was an entirely separate legal document from a different financial institution. My eyes quickly scanned the dense, formal text. Halfway down the page, a specific clause jumped out at me like a physical blow. The document required me to legally attest that I had, quoting the paper directly, "received full benefit and final disbursement from a custodial investment account established for my benefit during my minority." My breath caught painfully in my throat. The room seemed to plunge into absolute silence. The rhythmic, mechanical hum of the ceiling air conditioning unit faded completely away. I had never heard of a custodial investment account. I had funded my entire 4-year university education with high-interest federal loans. I had lived in a freezing apartment, eating cheap noodles. I had worked late-night shifts smelling of stale grease just to afford gas for a broken car. I had sent them $300 every single month for years because they constantly claimed they were drowning in medical debt. I had never been handed a single dollar from any sort of early life fund, moving entirely on instinct. I shifted my hand and pulled the next page from beneath his hovering fingers. It was an ancient, slightly faded photocopied bank statement, printed clearly across the top right corner in bold. Undeniable letters were the words, "For beneficiary Paige Elise Underwood." "Dad," I said softly, tracing the printed letters of my own name with my fingertip. "What is this account?" His face lost all of its color in an instant. He snatched his hand back as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. "It is nothing," he stammered, his polished, businesslike demeanor completely collapsing into pure panic. "It is just an old tax vehicle, a defunct, useless savings account your grandfather set up ages ago. It was drained for general family expenses years before you even went to college. The lawyer just needs you to sign off on it so we can close the probate loop. Please. Paige, do not make this complicated. The whole family is waiting on this money." He was lying to my face. The sheer panic vibrating off his body was unmistakable. He was trying to use a dead relative's minor inheritance as a Trojan horse to trick me into legally absolving him of something massive and terrible. He was banking heavily on my lifelong habit of just being the strong, compliant daughter who did what she was told to keep the peace. I looked up from the paper and finally met his eyes. My gaze was steady, cold, and entirely unyielding. The obedient daughter who had cried over empty wedding chairs was gone. "I am not signing anything today," I stated clearly. "I need to read this carefully. I need to understand exactly what I'm releasing before I put my name on a legal document." "You cannot do that," he barked, his voice cracking with sudden, desperate anger. "I need that signature right now. You are going to hold up the entire family. Beau needs his share of Aunt Lorraine's estate to finish the municipal permits for the Charleston Lounge. Your mother is stressed. You are being entirely unreasonable." "Paige, I am being thorough," I countered, pulling the 2 exposed pages toward my chest. "If it is just an old tax vehicle, it can wait 24 hours for me to review it." He stood up so violently that his heavy chair scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. He looked at the 2 pages in my hand, then looked frantically at the glass door. Suddenly terrified that someone in my office might hear him shouting and intervene, he was trapped squarely between his desperate need for my signature and his overwhelming fear of public exposure. "Fine," he hissed, his face now flushed and angry, mottled red. "Keep those 2 pages. Read them. Call me tonight when you finally come to your senses. I have to go feed the parking meter outside." He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the conference room. Desperate to escape the interrogation he knew was inevitably coming, the heavy glass door swung shut behind him, sealing me back into the quiet of the office. I sat alone at the table, staring at the thick manila folder my father had abandoned in his panic. He had taken his keys and his pen, but he had left the master file behind. I pulled it toward me, untied the string closure, and began working through the historical documents beneath the fake release forms. What I found was a meticulously documented timeline of grand larceny. The primary document was an original establishment form for a custodial investment account. The date at the top indicated it had been created when I was exactly 11 years old. The founding contributor was listed as my maternal grandfather, Walter Beckett. The initial principal deposit was a staggering $135,000. I ran my fingers over the black ink, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of that number. Growing up, I had been conditioned to believe our family was constantly hovering on the brink of financial ruin. Yet, sitting quietly in a secure market index all those years, bearing my legal name, was a fortune. Grandpa Walter had attached a legally binding letter of intent to the original deposit. The language was incredibly specific and ironclad. The funds were explicitly designated for the sole benefit of Paige Elise Underwood. He had detailed 3 approved avenues for disbursement upon my reaching adulthood: funding for a graduate school education, a down payment on a first home, or seed capital for an independent business venture. It was a fortress of financial security meant exclusively for me. It was absolutely not a general family slush fund. I turned to the next section of the folder, which contained decades of monthly bank statements detailing the account activity. As an auditor, I spent my days reconstructing financial timelines. My brain automatically began aligning the dates of the massive cash withdrawals with the historical timeline of my family. The first major deduction occurred during the summer I turned 15. I looked at the date and felt the blood drain from my face. It matched the exact month Beau was enrolled in his elite, out-of-state summer boarding program. The withdrawal amount matched the tuition cost perfectly. I flipped another page. 2 years later, a second significant withdrawal was executed. The amount was identical to the standard down payment required for the brand new luxury sport utility vehicle. Beau drove to high school while I walked 3 miles to my diner job. The paper trail became a nauseating roadmap of my brother's manufactured success. Every time Beau stumbled, my parents had quietly logged into my future and liquidated my assets to catch him. There was a massive cash transfer executed the same month he required expensive private tutoring to graduate. There was an agonizingly large withdrawal that perfectly aligned with the exact week he needed emergency capital to bail out his doomed food truck project. There was another line item indicating a massive wire transfer to a corporate defense attorney right after Beau got involved in a messy vendor contract dispute. The largest single deduction occurred 4 years ago. It was a staggering lump sum that nearly depleted the remaining balance of the entire account. I did not even have to guess what that money had bought. It was the exact season Beau and his new wife, Tessa, had proudly posed with the keys to their first upscale townhouse, a purchase my parents had publicly bragged about helping them secure. I sat there, staring at the columns of numbers, as the sheer suffocating injustice of it all crashed over me. While I was sitting in financial aid offices begging for high-interest federal loans to pay for my own textbooks, my parents were steadily draining my grandfather's gift to me, while I was working exhausted night shifts in a greasy uniform, terrified of missing a rent payment. They were using my money to ensure Beau never had to face a single consequence, while I was dutifully wiring them $300 on the first day of every single month to cover their alleged medical hardships. They were actively using my stolen inheritance to maintain the glamorous illusion of Beau's business acumen. They had literally stolen my safety net to weave a golden parachute for him. I reached the very bottom of the folder. Beneath the final stack of zero balance statements lay a sealed, aged ivory envelope. It was not a bank document. It was personal, written across the front, in Grandpa Walter's distinct, elegant cursive handwriting, was a specific instruction for Paige when you are finally old enough to stop apologizing for taking up space. My hands shook violently as I broke the old wax seal and unfolded the thick stationery inside. My dearest Paige, the letter began. If you are reading this, I am long gone, and I suspect you have finally discovered the truth of your financial standing. I am writing this to tell you what I could never say out loud in your mother's house without causing you further grief. I see it all. I see how they look right past you. I see how they have decided you are the strong one, the child who requires no tending, so they can pour every ounce of their energy and resources into your brother. It is a profound failure of parenting, and it breaks my heart. I swallowed hard, the tight knot in my throat aching fiercely. He had known, all those years. Someone had actually seen the reality of my existence. I established this fund because I know the exact kind of difficult road they are paving for you. The letter continued. I wanted to ensure you had a fair starting line when you entered the world. However, I am a pragmatic man. I know my daughter, and I know your father. My greatest fear in leaving this earth is that they will look at your security and see only a convenient emergency fund for Beau's inevitable missteps. I fear they will rationalize taking what is yours because they believe you can simply survive without it. If this envelope is in your hands, and the account is empty, it means my worst fear came true. Do not forgive them for this. Paige, do not be the accommodating daughter they trained you to be. They relied on your silence to commit this theft. If they treated your future as their backup plan, I want you to fight. Take back what is yours. Stop being the strong girl who takes the hits, and become the woman who hits back. I read the final line 3 times. The words seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. Stop being the strong girl who takes the hits, and become the woman who hits back. I carefully folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. I closed the thick manila folder and rested my hands flat on top of the cardboard cover. Up until this exact moment, my grief over my family had always been a wet, heavy thing. I had cried over the neglected birthdays. I had cried in the bridal shop. I had cried over the empty chairs at my wedding. But as I sat in that quiet conference room, the tears completely stopped. The sorrow simply evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, blinding clarity. I was no longer the discarded daughter mourning a family that never truly wanted her. I was an auditor who had just uncovered a massive, multi-year embezzlement scheme. My parents had stolen my financial foundation to build a monument to my brother. They had looked at my struggle and decided it was an acceptable price to pay for Beau's comfort. I felt my posture change. My spine straightened. The cold, calculating energy that usually helped me untangle complex public tax grids now locked entirely onto my own parents. They had thought I was too compliant, too deeply conditioned by guilt, to ever hold them accountable. They had bet their entire future on my silence. They were about to find out they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. I did not want an explanation. I did not want an apology. I was going to calculate every single stolen penny, compound the interest, and tear their world apart to get it all back. When I unlocked the door to our apartment that evening, Owen was standing at the stove, stirring a simmering pot of soup. The warm domestic scent of garlic and roasted tomatoes filled the small space, a jarring contrast to the absolute ice freezing my veins. I did not take off my coat. I walked directly to the dining table, pushed aside a stack of sorted mail, and emptied the contents of the manila folder across the bare wood. Owen turned off the burner, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked over. He looked at my face, registered the dangerous, hollow calm in my eyes, and did not ask if I was okay. He simply pulled out a chair and began reading the documents I had arranged in chronological order. He read the original trust establishment letter. He read the withdrawal slips. He read Grandpa Walter's final, hidden note. Owen did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me that family is complicated or suggest that we should try to understand their perspective. He reached out, placed his hand firmly over mine, and delivered a perfectly precise assessment. "This is conversion with paperwork," Owen said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "They did not just play favorites, Paige. They committed systemic financial fraud." The very next morning, I took a personal day from the renewal fund and drove to the downtown financial district. I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor of a sleek glass-walled skyscraper to meet with Mara Ellison. She was a senior partner at Ellison Pike Advisory, a boutique law firm specializing in high-stakes estate litigation and aggressive asset recovery. Mara was a woman in her late 50s who wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and possessed the clinical, unsentimental demeanor of a surgeon preparing for a difficult procedure. I laid the entire timeline out on her polished mahogany conference table. Mara reviewed the paperwork in absolute silence for 20 solid minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mask of professional lethality. "Your father was incredibly foolish to leave this master file in your possession," Mara stated, tapping a silver pen against the bank statements. "This is not a mere moral failing or a vague breach of fiduciary duty. This is the textbook definition of misappropriation of beneficiary assets. Furthermore, because he actively attempted to coerce you into signing a fraudulent release of liability yesterday, we can establish a clear pattern of malicious concealment. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out the financial anatomy of my parents' theft. We erected a massive timeline on Mara's glass whiteboard. In black marker, we charted every single dollar my parents had siphoned from my grandfather's trust to fund Beau's life. In red marker, directly beneath those dates, we charted my own financial history. The visual result was sickening. The exact month my father withdrew $20,000 to bail out Beau's failing food truck, I had signed a binding promissory note for a $20,000 federal student loan at a crippling 7.9% interest rate. I had been forced to borrow money from the government to survive while my own parents were laundering my inheritance to my brother. The case tightened into an inescapable trap over the next 48 hours when Mara deployed her investigative team. They uncovered a surprise witness who shattered any potential defense my parents might try to mount. Dean Beckett, my grandfather's younger brother, was still alive and living in a retirement community 2 hours away. When Mara's investigator contacted him, Dean provided a sworn, notarized affidavit stating that Walter had explicitly and repeatedly told my parents the trust was never, under any circumstances, to be used for Beau. But the absolute killing blow came from a digital archive. Mara tracked down Gloria Timmons, the former regional manager of the bank that had originally held the custodial account. Gloria had retired 5 years ago, but she had retained copies of highly concerning correspondence to protect her own professional license. She happily provided Mara with a printed copy of an email my father had sent her a decade prior. In the email, my father explicitly asked the bank manager how he could, quoting the document directly, "liquidate in stages so it does not trigger questions from the beneficiary later." It was premeditated, it was calculated. It was undeniable proof of criminal intent. As the legal machinery roared to life, my phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering, putting the device on speakerphone and placing it on my desk. "Paige?" My mother sobbed loudly into the receiver. "Paige, are you there?" For a brief, naive fraction of a second. A phantom reflex in my chest wondered if my father had confessed to her about leaving the folder, and she was calling to beg for my forgiveness. I remained silent, waiting for her to speak. "Paige, please answer me," she cried, her voice hitching with manufactured panic. "I was just at the grocery store, and my debit card was declined. I checked our joint checking account. The automatic transfer did not go through on the 1st of the month. Did your bank make an error? Why did you not send the $300? You know your father's medication copays are due this week." I stared at the phone, completely mesmerized by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the woman. She was not crying because her daughter had been profoundly betrayed. She was not crying because the foundation of our family was built on a massive lie. She was crying because her personal, automated teller machine had suddenly stopped dispensing cash. That single, pathetic phone call stripped away the last remaining, microscopic shred of guilt I held regarding my parents. It laid the absolute void of our relationship completely bare. "My bank did not make an error, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I canceled the transfer. Permanently." "But why?" she gasped, genuinely shocked that her emotional manipulation was failing. "We rely on that money. How could you be so selfish?" "Call Beau," I replied coldly. "Ask him to spot you the cash. After all, he has been living off my money for the last 15 years. I ended the call and immediately blocked her number. Less than 2 hours later, Beau called. He was frantic, his voice vibrating with a panicked, defensive energy. He tried to play the role of the oblivious, innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of a parental mistake. "Paige, listen to me," Beau pleaded, the background noise indicating he was pacing rapidly on the hardwood floors of his new Charleston lounge. "Mom is hysterical. She said you cut them off and accused them of stealing. I swear to you, Whatever Dad did, I had absolutely no idea the money belonged exclusively to you. I thought they were just using their own savings to help me out. You have to believe me." I leaned back in my office chair. "You really had no idea, Bo." "None," he insisted quickly, eager to wash his hands of the liability. "Dad always just told me he was tapping into Granddad's launch fund to help me get my businesses off the ground." "That is all I knew, I swear." I closed my eyes. He was so incredibly arrogant that he did not even realize he had just handed me the rope to hang him with. Grandpa Walter only had one launch fund. "Bo," I said softly, the lethal edge in my voice making him instantly fall silent on the other end. "And my name was the only one on the trust documents. If you knew the phrase launch fund, you knew it came from him, and you knew he never left a single dime to you." "Paige, wait, that is not what I meant," he stammered, his facade crumbling as he realized his fatal slip of the tongue. "Do not call me again," I interrupted. "Your lawyer can speak to mine." I disconnected the line. The time for familial negotiations was officially over. The very next morning, Mara Ellison formally dispatched a devastating legal demand letter via certified courier to my parents' residence. The document was a masterpiece of legal violence. It did not ask for a negotiation. It demanded the immediate, unconditional restitution of the original $135,000 principal. Furthermore, it demanded the retroactive application of compounded market interest spanning the entire duration of the theft. Finally, it demanded full punitive damages equivalent to the exact amount of interest I was currently paying on the federal student loans I should never have been forced to take. The final paragraph of Mara's letter contained a meticulously worded ultimatum. My parents were given exactly 7 business days to comply and initiate the full wire transfer. If the funds were not secured in my escrow account by the deadline, Mara stated she would file an emergency injunction with the state court. That injunction would instantly freeze all of their personal bank accounts, their retirement portfolios, and, catastrophically for Bo, the commercial lines of credit tied to their home equity that were currently keeping his Charleston rooftop lounge afloat. This was no longer just anger. It had become a formal legal process, and it was moving with a force my family could no longer stop. My father bypassed the blocked number on my cellular phone by calling directly into my office extension at the Community Renewal Fund. When I picked up the receiver, expecting a municipal planner to be on the other end, his voice filled the earpiece. He did not sound apologetic or remorseful. He sounded like a manager scolding an employee for refusing to fall back in line. "We need to stop this legal nonsense right now. Paige," he commanded, entirely skipping any form of greeting. "Your mother is beside herself. You are blowing a minor historical accounting decision completely out of proportion. It was absolutely not embezzlement. It was simply family reallocating. We took idle assets from one column and moved them to another to ensure the overall success of the household." I sat back in my desk chair, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The sheer audacity of his sterile corporate jargon was staggering. "You took a 6-figure trust fund legally designated exclusively for my future and gave it to Bo to buy a luxury vehicle and bail out a failed food truck. That is not reallocating, Dad. That is stealing. We are prepared to make you whole," he countered quickly, aggressively ignoring the word stealing. "We will establish a formal multi-year repayment plan. We can send you a fixed monthly amount, with a reasonable interest rate, over the next 10 years. But you have to drop this lawsuit immediately. Furthermore, you must sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding Harbor Ember. We cannot have you running around making Bo look bad in front of his new hospitality investors. His reputation is on the line here." I let out a harsh, utterly humorless laugh. He wanted me to accept a vague, unenforceable promissory note from the very people who had just spent 15 years lying to my face, all to protect my brother's delicate public image. If I agreed to a blind installment plan, I knew exactly how the game would play out. They would stretch the payments out, manufacture new sudden financial emergencies, manipulate the timeline, and inevitably cast me as the cruel, unreasonable villain every single time I asked for my scheduled check. My answer is no, I stated clearly. You have exactly 5 days left on Mara Ellison's deadline. Pay the lump sum, or we go to court. I hung up the phone. When logic and business jargon completely failed, my family immediately resorted to their oldest, most reliably destructive weapon: guilt. By the following afternoon, my mother had initiated a scorched earth smear campaign across our entire extended family network. My blocked cellular phone meant I did not hear her crying directly, but the collateral damage quickly reached me through my aunts and cousins. My maternal aunt left a scathing 5-minute voicemail on my work system. She claimed my mother was suffering from severe heart palpitations and had not slept in 3 days. The narrative my parents had carefully, deliberately spun to the relatives, was that they had simply borrowed a small amount of money during a desperate medical crisis many years ago. Now, according to the rumor mill, I was a greedy, ungrateful daughter actively trying to destroy my aging, fragile parents just for a quick payout. They painted me as a monster trying to leave them homeless. They never mentioned the original principal amount. They never mentioned Beau's endless business bailouts. They only weaponized their age and their supposed suffering. That emotional warfare might have worked flawlessly on the 20-year-old version of Paige. It might have broken the girl who quietly sent them $300 a month out of a misplaced sense of duty. But the 34-year-old woman sitting in Mara Ellison's office later that week felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. Mara slid a fresh, single-page document across her polished conference table. She looked remarkably pleased, smiling the exact way a predator smiles when its prey makes a fatal misstep. "Your parents are not just unethical," Mara said, tapping her manicured fingernail against the paper. "They are remarkably stupid." 2 days after my courier delivered our formal demand letter, your parents visited their primary bank branch. They attempted to initiate a wire transfer of roughly $200,000 from their joint savings account into a brand new, separate account registered solely under your mother's maiden name. I stared at the flagged transaction record, my mind quickly processing the data. They tried to hide the cash. They tried to dissipate the marital assets to shield them from a pending civil judgment, Mara corrected, her tone sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. It is a textbook fraudulent conveyance. They thought they could move the money completely out of reach before we formally filed suit. But because of the timeline and the sudden, massive nature of the transfer, the bank flagged it for internal review. I received a quiet notification from a colleague in their compliance department. "What does this mean for us?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "It means we no longer have to wait for the 7-day deadline to expire," Mara replied, standing up and smoothing the front of her jacket. This attempted transfer gave me exactly the legal leverage I needed. Yesterday afternoon, I filed an ex parte emergency injunction with the state court. A judge reviewed the irrefutable evidence of their attempted asset concealment and granted the motion immediately. As of 9 o'clock this morning, every single financial account tied to your parents' names has been entirely frozen. For the very first time, my parents finally understood that this was no longer an emotional negotiation. They could not cry, manipulate, or gaslight their way out of a court-ordered asset freeze. They were completely, legally paralyzed. The sudden financial lockdown triggered an immediate, explosive reaction from the one person who had the absolute most to lose: Beau. He called Owen's cell phone that evening, fully aware that I had permanently blocked his number. Owen answered, listened for exactly 5 seconds, and wordlessly handed the device to me. He pressed the speakerphone button so we could both hear the chaos. Beau was not crying or begging. He was hyperventilating with pure, unadulterated rage. "Are you completely insane?" Beau screamed through the small speaker, the loud sound of glass shattering in the background indicating he had just thrown something against a wall. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? You froze their home equity line of credit. I need that credit line. Tessa and I are signing the commercial lease for Harbor Ember location number 2 on Friday. If the investors see our primary financial backing is completely frozen, the entire expansion deal collapses. You are ruining my life." He was not apologizing for spending my stolen inheritance. He was furious that my attempt to reclaim my own property was interfering with his grand brand expansion. His absolute, blind entitlement was breathtaking to witness. "It is not your money, Beau," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously soft register. "It was never your money. It was mine. Grandpa Walter left it exclusively for me. They stole it to give to you. And now, I am taking every single cent back." "You did not even need it," Beau shouted, his voice cracking with panic desperation. In his frantic, cornered state, he completely lost all ability to filter his words. He reached for the ultimate justification. The core toxic philosophy our entire family had been built upon, and hurled it at me like a physical weapon. "Dad always said investing in you was completely useless because you do not need anyone to save you. You always figure it out. You always survive no matter what happens. I needed that money to actually build something real. You were just going to sit on it." Those specific words hung suspended in the quiet air of my apartment. It was the absolute, naked truth of my existence, spoken out loud without any protective varnish for the very first time. They had intentionally weaponized my own resilience against me, because I was strong enough to survive their constant neglect. They felt entirely justified in robbing my future to fund the golden child who categorically refused to stand on his own 2 feet. That single sentence was the final, heavy hammer that completely shattered any lingering, microscopic illusion I had left regarding my family. It permanently killed the last pathetic remnants of the dutiful, accommodating daughter. "Good luck explaining your frozen assets to your investors. Beau," I said. "Tell them your sister says hello." I ended the call and calmly handed the phone back to Owen. The next morning, I sat across from Mara Ellison one final time before the formal settlement conference was scheduled to begin. She placed a single, heavily redacted bank profile directly in the center of the table between us. "I received the final forensic accounting of their frozen assets late last night," Mara explained, her voice dropping to a serious, predatory hum. "Your parents maintain a high-yield money market savings account. They have been quietly hoarding cash in it for years, likely preparing for their own retirement and building a reserve for Beau's next inevitable business bailout." She slid a small piece of paper with a handwritten number across the polished wood. I looked down at the figure. "The current balance sitting in that specific money market account," Mara continued, leaning forward, "is almost exactly the total sum of the original principal they stole from you, plus the compounded market interest over 15 years, plus the legal fees you have incurred fighting them. It is sitting right there, entirely liquid and available." I stared intently at the handwritten number. It represented a decade of my silent struggles, my painfully delayed dreams, and my stolen security, all neatly quantified into a single, undeniable bank balance. "They have 2 distinct choices when they walk into that mediation room tomorrow," Mara said, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute certainty. "They can sign over that entire money market account to you right now, completely draining their liquid safety net in one signature. Or they can refuse, and we take this straight to a public trial, where the fraud becomes a matter of permanent public record, and Beau's prestigious investors find out his entire hospitality empire is built on stolen funds." The psychological warfare was over. The trap was perfectly set, and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. There was nowhere left for them to run, hide, or manipulate. They were finally going to pay the bill in full. The settlement conference took place in a sterile, windowless boardroom on the 50th floor of Mara Ellison's downtown law firm. My parents sat across the expansive, polished mahogany table, looking physically diminished. The arrogant, dismissive attitude my father had carried into my office weeks prior had completely evaporated. The looming, very real threat of a public civil trial had broken them. They both knew that if this case went to open court, Beau would be officially subpoenaed. He would be dragged onto the public record as the primary beneficiary of stolen assets. The high-profile investors backing his second Charleston location would instantly pull their funding upon discovering his entire hospitality brand was built on a foundation of familial embezzlement. Left with absolutely no leverage, nowhere to hide, and no more relatives to manipulate, they were finally forced into the harsh fluorescent light of accountability. My father attempted one final, desperate maneuver to save face. He cleared his throat and offered a compromise settlement, calling it a generous family support package meant to help a daughter in need. I did not let him finish his sentence. I leaned forward and looked him directly in the eyes. I refused to accept a single cent framed as a charitable gift. I refused to listen to their half-hearted, manipulative apologies. I explicitly instructed Mara that I would absolutely not sign any non-disclosure agreement protecting Beau's reputation, and I would not sign any settlement contract that did not strictly and legally define their actions as the intentional misuse of beneficiary assets. Mara pushed the final, binding settlement agreement across the wood. The math was brutally precise and entirely unforgiving. It demanded the complete, immediate restitution of the original principal withdrawn from my grandfather's trust. Added to that was the compounded market interest calculated over the last 15 years. Finally, it included the exact amount of punitive interest I had accrued on the federal student loans I was forced to take out to survive. The grand total amounted to almost exactly the entire cash balance sitting in their frozen money market account. It was every single dollar they had saved for their own comfort and Beau's future emergencies. The mediator, a quiet man in a gray suit, handed my father a heavy black pen. My father picked it up. His hand was trembling so violently that he could barely keep the tip of the pen steady on the signature line. He was legally authorizing the bank to wire their entire liquid safety net directly into my escrow account. Beside him, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on my mother. She broke down into loud, genuine sobs. She looked across the table at me, her face contorted with grief, not for what she had done to me, but for the one child she actually cared about protecting. "How can you do this to us?" she cried out, her voice echoing in the stark room. "That was our emergency fund. That was money to protect Beau's future." I looked back at her, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, icy calm. "No, I replied, my voice slicing through her tears like a scalpel. "It was always money stolen from mine." He signed the papers. He did not look up. They left the room in absolute silence. A defeated, empty couple realizing they had bankrupted their own twilight years to fund a golden child who would never, ever be able to support them in return. Within 2 hours, the bank compliance officer executed the wire transfer. I stood in the lobby of the law firm waiting for the elevator and watched the digital screen of my mobile phone. The banking application refreshed. A massive, 6-figure sum suddenly materialized in my available balance. Staring at those digits, I did not feel a sudden rush of greed. I did not feel the thrill of an unexpected lottery win. I felt the profound, overwhelming sensation of my own stolen time being returned to me. Every exhausted late-night shift I had worked at the diner, every panic attack over paying rent, every single year I had delayed my own life and suppressed my own dreams, it was all quantified, monetized, and handed back. I had quite literally emptied their bank account. I had done it with legal filings, historical bank statements, and a truth they never believed I would have the courage to confront. The very next morning, I logged into my loan servicer portal and initiated a massive, final transfer. I completely wiped out the student debt that had haunted my entire adult life. A few weeks later, Owen and I used a significant portion of the recovered funds to place a 20% down payment on our very first home. It was a beautiful property with a large, bright garden and a heavy, secure front door that I could lock against the past. I also formally and permanently terminated the $300 monthly transfer I had been blindly sending them for years. That financial obligation was dead and buried in the dirt. However, the most unexpected closure came from what I chose to do with the remaining capital. Instead of absorbing the rest into a standard retirement portfolio, I worked with Mara to establish a specialized educational trust. I named it the Walter Beckett Foundation, It was a modest but robust grant program, specifically designed to provide tuition assistance to young women who were working their way through university without any financial backing from their families. I took the exact money my parents had betrayed me with and transformed it into a lifeline for strangers. I made absolutely sure that my grandfather's original intention of providing a fair starting line would finally be realized, just not in the way he initially planned. Months later, Owen and I finally received our printed wedding album from the photographer. I sat on the sofa in our new living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, slowly turning the heavy, glossy pages. I stopped at a wide-angle photograph taken just before the ceremony began. In the absolute center of the frame, resting perfectly in the front row, were the two empty wooden chairs with the gold name cards. I looked at that picture for a very long time, tracing the edges of the empty space with my index finger. And then I smiled. A real, deep, unburdened smile. My parents had deliberately skipped my wedding because they thought leaving those two seats empty would humiliate me. They believed their glaring absence would make me feel small, discarded, and eternally desperate for their approval. They thought it would reinforce the dynamic that I was the strong one who could just endure their constant rejection. They had absolutely no idea that by refusing to show up that day, they had accidentally forged the exact version of the woman who would finally wake up, see clearly, and take absolutely everything back. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.